Hi, I'm Whoopi Goldberg, and we're in New York City today for a very special occasion. Now, how special is it? Well, it's not every day that you can get William Shatner, and we have managed to gather them together for what we are calling a Star Trek Summit.
In January of 1990, a technician in a London broadcast facility queued up a tape of American science fiction. To the untrained eye, it was just another campy hour of starships and phasers. But as the dialogue rolled, a cold sweat hit the room. On screen, a pale android calmly noted that a unified Ireland had finally been achieved in the year 2024, and that it was won entirely through a campaign of political terrorism. That single line of fictional history was treated like an ideological bomb. Censors panicked. The tape was pulled. For nearly 2 decades, an episode of a show famous for preaching absolute peace was locked away from the public, banned by broadcasters who feared that a fictional future might spark a very real war. Was it banned for good reason, though? The Forbidden Archive. The episode in question was Star Trek, The Next Generation's 3rd season entry, The High Ground. On paper, the plot followed a standard sci-fi procedural formula. The crew of the USS Enterprise D arrives at the planet Rutia 4 to deliver medical supplies. While there, Dr. Beverly Crusher is abruptly kidnapped by a radical separatist group known as the Ansata. The Ansata want independence from the ruling Rutian government, and they use a unique, dimension-shifting teleportation technology called the Inverter to launch hit-and-run guerrilla strikes. But there is a catch. Every time an Ansata fighter uses the Inverter, it permanently damages their DNA on a cellular level, slowly killing them. It is a literal manifestation of a cause consuming its own people. For American audiences watching in early 1990, the episode felt like a well-crafted, albeit standard, allegory for global insurgencies. Writer Melinda Snodgrass had originally intended the story to echo the historical complexities of the Algerian War for Independence from France. It was meant to examine the messy, morally gray territory where diplomacy breaks down and asymmetric warfare begins. Captain Jean-Luc Picard is caught in the middle, forced to navigate the classic Starfleet dilemma. How do you maintain neutral, diplomatic relations with a legitimate government while acknowledging that the government's oppressive policies are what birthed the rebellion in the first place? The intellectual peak of the episode happens not in a phaser fight, but during a quiet, philosophical debate in the Enterprise Ready Room. Lieutenant Commander Data, trying to comprehend human history's cyclical relationship with violence, asks Captain Picard about the efficacy of armed rebellion. Data, functioning as a walking, talking database of galactic history, casually rattles off examples of asymmetric warfare successfully achieving political goals. He mentions the independence of the American colonies. He mentions the French Revolution. And then, with the detached analytical calm unique to an android, he states that the Irish unification of 2024 was achieved through the successful deployment of terrorism. To the executives at the BBC and Ireland's RTE, that line wasn't a fascinating piece of world building, it was an active spark in a powder keg. When the episode was scheduled to air, the United Kingdom was in the bleakest depths of the Troubles. The Provisional Irish Republican Army, IRA, was actively conducting bombing campaigns, British military forces were heavily deployed in Northern Ireland, and blood was regularly being spilled on both sides. The British government had gone so far as to pass a broadcasting ban in 1988 that prevented the actual voices of Sinn Féin politicians and Republican paramilitaries from being heard on T5 or radio, forcing news stations to hire actors to read their statements. In an environment where the state was actively suppressing the spoken words of real-world dissidents, a massively popular American television show, asserting that the IRA's methods would eventually win out in 2024 was an unthinkable broadcast risk. The BBC didn't just push the episode to a later time slot, they dropped the axe entirely. The High Ground was completely excised from the initial broadcast run of The Next Generation in the UK and the Republic of Ireland. When the episode was finally allowed onto British airwaves, it was heavily edited, with Data's entire monologue completely scrubbed from the audio track. The unedited version wouldn't see a proper full television broadcast in the UK until 2007, nearly 2 decades after it was filmed. What makes The High Ground the definitive anchor for Star Trek censorship is how the real-world timeline eventually caught up with the fictional one. As the world crept closer to the actual year 2024, the episode transformed from a banned piece of vintage media into a bizarre cultural touchstone. Political analysts, sci-fi fans, and internet commentators watched the calendar turn, evaluating how close a 1990 television script came to predicting the geopolitical future. While a violent unification did not manifest on the timeline data specified, the sheer panic the prediction caused in 1990 proved that Star Trek had a terrifying habit of slicing right through fantasy and nicking a raw nerve in human reality. But how did a franchise built entirely on the promise of a peaceful, harmonious future find itself so heavily policed by real-world governments? Boldly going over the line. The international panic over a single line of dialogue in 1990 wasn't an isolated glitch in the franchise's history. It was the continuation of a decades-long war between Star Trek's writers and global censors. To understand why a fictional future looked so dangerous to real-world governments, you have to look back at the 60s. When Gene Roddenberry first pitched the original series, he famously marketed it to network executives as Wagon Train to the Stars, a safe, episodic space western. But that pitch was a Trojan horse. Roddenberry and his writing room had no intention of just telling stories about ray guns and green-skinned aliens. They wanted to use the safe, abstracted lens of science fiction to smuggle radical commentary on race, war, and state control onto primetime television. The problem was that the censors were watching every single frame. Nowhere was this cultural collision more intense than in post-war West Germany. In 1968, the franchise unleashed an episode titled Patterns of Force. The narrative premise was classic Star Trek interventionism. The crew of the Enterprise arrives at the planet Echos looking for John Gill, a missing Federation cultural observer. When they beam down, they are horrified to discover an entire world modeled directly after Nazi Germany. Gill, in a catastrophic violation of the Prime Directive, had introduced fascism to a chaotic alien society, believing a benign dictatorship could bring rapid efficiency and order. Instead, the system did exactly what it always does. It weaponized the populace, creating a brutal regime dedicated to the systematic extermination of the neighboring planet's residents. For American audiences, the episode was a heavy-handed, anti-authoritarian morality play. But for West German broadcasters, it was a waking nightmare. The nation was still deeply traumatized, clawing its way out of the shadow of World War II and heavily policing any media that featured Nazi iconography, uniforms, or slogans. Seeing Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock, disguised in full SS uniforms, surrounded by swastikas, was a visual shock the country simply could not allow on entertainment television. The German public broadcaster, ZDF, completely banned Patterns of Force. It wasn't just edited, it was buried due to intense post-war sensitivities. The episode was completely omitted from Germany's initial television runs throughout the 70s and 80s. German fans wouldn't get a chance to see the episode until a specialized pay TV broadcast in 1995, and it didn't air on free, public television until 2011, 43 years after it was filmed. While Germany was locking away the imagery of fascism, Great Britain's BBC was building an entirely different kind of forbidden archive. During the late 60s and 70s, British television programmers viewed Star Trek not as high-concept philosophy, but as a family-friendly action show scheduled for an early evening time slot. This mismatch in expectations led to what fans now call the BBC blacklist, a trio of episodes completely banned from British airwaves for decades due to concerns over violence, madness, and psychological torture. The first casualty of the British blacklist was The Empath. The story finds Kirk, Spock, and McCoy trapped inside an underground chamber by a race of highly advanced aliens called the Vians. The Vians subject the crew to intense, sadistic, psychological, and physical torture, forcing a mute, empathic alien woman to watch and absorb their pain. The BBC viewed the episode's stark, minimalist aesthetic, set against a pitch-black, void-like soundstage, as deeply disturbing and entirely inappropriate for children. Censors argued that the raw focus on sadism and the slow, deliberate breakdown of human bodies crossed the line from adventurous space fantasy into pure psychological horror. Shortly after, the BBC dropped the axe on Whom Gods Destroy. Set in a futuristic asylum for the criminally insane, the episode features a shape-shifting former Starfleet captain named Garth of Izar who takes over the facility. Garth subjects Captain Kirk to brutal tortures, including a chair rigged to blast intense electrical currents directly into the brain. It also featured a deeply unsettling dance by an alien woman that culminated in her being casually blown up with an explosive device. British programmers determined that the episode's vivid depictions of mental illness, combined with graphic electrical torture and madness, were a bridge too far for tea-time television. But the most famous intersection of Star Trek and cultural censorship happened in an episode that the BBC banned for physical cruelty, while American networks nearly sabotaged over a single kiss. That episode was Plato's Stepchildren. The plot follows the crew as they encounter a race of telekinetic beings who model their society after ancient Greece. These aliens use their minds to take absolute control of the crew's bodies, humiliating them like puppets. In one sequence, Alexander, a marginalized citizen of the planet, is forced to endure agonizing physical degradation. The BBC banned the episode outright, citing the relentless, unyielding body control cruelty inflicted upon the characters. Yet, history remembers Plato's Stepchildren for an entirely different reason. Under the telekinetic control of the aliens, Captain Kirk is forced to embrace and kiss Lieutenant Uhura. It was a historic moment, television's first scripted, interracial kiss between a white man and a black woman. The tension behind the scenes during the filming of that kiss was immense. NBC executives panicked, terrified that Southern television stations would boycott the broadcast and pull vital advertising revenue. The network demanded that the scene be filmed two ways, once with the kiss and once with the actors turning their backs to the camera to fake it. William Shatner and Nichelle Nichols, fully aware of the social weight of the moment, deliberately blew every single take of the fake version, stumbling, making funny faces, and forcing the network's hand. The real kiss stayed in the American broadcast, cementing Star Trek's legacy as a cultural disruptor. Physical cruelty and historical trauma were easy targets for censors, but sometimes the most terrifying threats came from inside the Federation itself. The gore and the government. By the late 80s, the television landscape had shifted dramatically. Audiences were growing desensitized, and networks were pushing the boundaries of what could be shown on primetime broadcasts. When Gene Roddenberry returned to television with Star Trek: The Next Generation, he instituted a rigid, almost religious mandate for his writing room, known colloquially by fans as the Roddenberry box. The rule was simple. Humanity and Starfleet had evolved past petty conflict. There was to be no interpersonal drama among the crew, no greed, and absolutely no internal corruption. Humanity was perfect. But during the show's rocky first season, a group of rebellious writers decided to smash that box into pieces, resulting in the most visually grotesque, heavily censored hours of television in the franchise's history. The episode was Conspiracy. The narrative plays out like a paranoid Cold War political thriller. Captain Picard receives a cryptic, high-priority message from a trusted colleague commanding him to meet in secret on a desolate planet. When Picard arrives, a handful of high-ranking Starfleet captains reveal a terrifying pattern. The behavior of Starfleet Command has radically altered. Orders are making no sense. Vital outposts are being strangely reallocated, and an insidious top-secret coup appears to be underway at the absolute highest levels of interstellar government. For an audience accustomed to Roddenberry's flawless utopian Starfleet, the premise was a psychological shock. The absolute moral bedrock of the Star Trek universe, the idea that the Federation was an unshakable force for good, was melting away. Picard secretly returns to Earth to investigate, sitting down for a tense dinner with the top admirals of Starfleet Command. It is here that the psychological thriller violently shifts gears into pure, unadulterated body horror. The admirals aren't acting under political blackmail or ideological corruption. They have been physically hollowed out. A race of small, pink, scorpion-like alien parasites has quietly invaded Earth, crawling down the throats of Starfleet's elite, wrapping their tentacles around the human brainstem and taking absolute parasitic control of their hosts. The terrifying reality is that the enemy isn't massing fleets at the border. The enemy is sitting at the head of the table, wearing the uniform, using the authority of the state to open the door for a total galactic invasion. What followed next was a sequence so extraordinarily violent, it completely shattered the broadcasting standards of the era. Picard and Commander Riker corner the conspiracy's ringleader, Admiral Quinn. When the parasitic organism inside Quinn realizes it has been exposed, it displays superhuman strength, tossing Riker through glass doors in a brutal, bone-crunching brawl. But the true climax occurs when Picard and Riker track the mother creature into the body of Admiral Remick. With no other choice to save the Federation, Picard and Riker raise their phasers, lock them onto maximum kill settings, and fire simultaneously. The visual effects team did not hold back. Remick's skin blisters and bubbles under the heat of the energy beams. His face melts in a horrific, agonizing display of practical effects. Then, in a final, shocking explosion of gore, Remick's chest cavity bursts open, exposing a bloody, rib-lined crater where his internal organs used to be. Peeking out from the smoking, liquefied remains of the human torso is the pulsating, hideous face of the alien Queen Mother. Picard and Riker don't hesitate. They vaporize the creature on the spot, leaving behind a smoking pile of scorched bone and human ash. When the episode hit the editing bays, the backlash was immediate and varied across global markets. In the United States, syndication networks scrambled, with several local stations slapping unprecedented, rare on-screen viewer discretion warnings onto the broadcast to alert parents of extreme graphic violence. Internationally, the scissors came out immediately. The BBC in the United Kingdom viewed the unedited climax as completely unbroadcastable for a family audience, heavily editing the episode to entirely remove the close-up shots of Remick's melting face and completely excising the visceral, chest-bursting explosion of blood and flesh. Up north, various stations in Canada completely refused to air the episode during its regular afternoon or early evening slots, forcing scheduling managers to migrate the airings exclusively to late-night blocks. In Germany, broadcasters like ZDF and Sat1 deemed the episode so completely antithetical to the peaceful spirit of the franchise and so excessively violent that it was blocked and banned entirely from their initial broadcast runs. Conspiracy remains a fascinating, bizarre anomaly in Star Trek lore because it proved that the franchise was capable of generating raw, primal terror. It weaponized body horror to show that the greatest threat to a utopia isn't an alien armada with cloaking devices, but the quiet, invisible erosion of its institutions from within. By forcing Picard to literally blow a human being apart to protect the ideals of the Federation, the writers didn't just cross a line of broadcasting violence. They dragged Star Trek kicking and screaming into a darker, more complicated reality. If a few isolated episodes could spark international blacklists, how did the franchise manage to survive, let alone conquer, global pop culture? The enemy within, breaking the Starfleet code. While external governments and network censors were busy policing what Star Trek could say to the public, an entirely different kind of battle was brewing behind the closed doors of the franchise's writing rooms. By the late 90s, the spin-offs Deep Space Nine and Voyager had moved entirely out of the shadow of Gene Roddenberry's direct supervision. Free from his strict utopian mandates, the showrunners decided to execute an internal coup against Starfleet's moral purity. They realized that the most shocking thing they could broadcast wasn't an alien monster or a banned political phrase. It was the sight of beloved Starfleet captains looking directly into the camera and admitting that the noble ideals of the Federation were a luxury they could no longer afford. The absolute flashpoint of this creative rebellion occurred in the Deep Space Nine masterpiece, In the Pale Moonlight. Facing a brutal, existential war that the Federation is actively losing, Captain Benjamin Sisko hatches a deeply unethical plot to trick the neutral Romulan Empire into entering the conflict. Sisko overrides his own medical officer to trade restricted, dangerous biogenic materials and systematically engages in bribery, forgery, and cover-ups. When his conspirator, a Cardassian spy, assassinates a Romulan senator to ensure the deception succeeds, Sisko doesn't confess. Instead, in a chilling final monologue delivered straight to the audience, Sisko states with absolute dead-eyed intensity that he can live with the blood on his hands because it saved the Federation. He then deletes the log. Sisko completely upended the franchise's philosophy, proving that a pristine utopia only gets to exist because someone in the shadows is willing to get their hands dirty to protect it. While Deep Space Nine was exploring the dark geopolitics of war, Star Trek Voyager was busy dropping an ethical bomb into a domestic storyline with the infamous episode Tuvix, when a transporter malfunction fuses two crew members into a single, highly capable sentient being named Tuvix. The ship's doctor discovers a way to reverse the accident. The terrifying catch? Tuvix doesn't want to die. He formally begs Captain Catherine Janeway for his basic right to exist, arguing that forcing the separation is an act of execution. The ship's doctor agrees, invoking his medical oath and refusing to perform the procedure. Janeway doesn't look for a convenient, comforting loophole. She manually programs the machine herself, forcing Tuvix into the transporter beam while he actively begs the silent, guilt-ridden crew for his life. For decades, fandom has been locked in an endless civil war over whether Janeway was a pragmatic leader or a cold-blooded killer. By airing stories like these, Star Trek accomplished something far more dangerous than slipping past real-world government censors. It turned its allegorical weapons completely inward, blowing up its own utopian myths to show that out in the cold reality of deep space, the necessary choice can still leave you looking like a monster. The Star Trek phenomenon and public reception. So, how did a franchise survive international bans, political firefights, and graphic body horror? It's important to look past the television screen and into the mechanics of the culture that surrounded it. Any other show facing this level of network resistance and regional censorship would have been quietly suffocated by executives. But Star Trek possessed a secret weapon that no other property in television history had ever managed to cultivate: an organized, fiercely protective, and highly intellectual fan base that refused to let the dream die. The survival of Star Trek is, fundamentally, the story of the first modern fandom. When the original series was airing in the late 60s, NBC was ready to drop the axe by the end of the second season due to dipping traditional Nielsen ratings. The journey from that initial 1966 premiere to a global phenomenon was entirely driven by fan intervention. In 1967, a fan named Beau Trimble and her husband John launched an unprecedented grassroots letter-writing campaign. They organized thousands of fans across the country to flood NBC headquarters with letters demanding the show remain on the air, resulting in over 110,000 fan letters burying network executives. It was a massive wake-up call for the network. NBC realized that while Star Trek might not have had the raw, massive numbers of a standard sitcom, its audience possessed an unparalleled demographic intensity and loyalty. The show was saved, granting it the crucial third season in 1968 needed to hit the magic number of episodes required for syndication. That syndication boom throughout the 70s transformed Star Trek from a canceled cult property into a multi-billion-dollar global juggernaut. Because the reruns were sold directly to local stations to air in late afternoons and weekends, the show bypassed the rigid control of a single prime-time network schedule. It became an ambient part of global popular culture. By the time The Next Generation was conceived in 1987, Paramount made a radical, brilliant business decision. They completely bypassed the big three networks and sold the show directly into first-run syndication. This structural independence gave Star Trek unprecedented creative freedom. If a network executive at an affiliate station was squeamish about an episode's political undertones, Paramount didn't care. Another 100 stations across the country were hungry to air it. The show was financially bulletproof. This massive success laid the foundation for an entire galaxy of spin-offs. Throughout the 90s, Deep Space Nine and Voyager aired simultaneously, creating a continuous, self-sustaining ecosystem of science fiction storytelling that dominated global airwaves. But why did the public stick with a franchise that regularly courted controversy and pushed past comfort zones? The answer lies in the unique psychological contract between Star Trek and its audience. Viewers didn't tune in despite the political allegories, they tuned in because of them. During the height of the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, and the Vietnam War, Mainstream television was largely a landscape of escapism, filled with pristine family sitcoms and predictable westerns. Star Trek offered something entirely different, a safe, abstracted arena where society could process its deepest anxieties. When Star Trek talked about alien factions tearing a planet apart over skin color, as they did in the classic episode Let That Be Your Last Battlefield, featuring aliens who were black on one side and white on the other, audiences weren't just watching a sci-fi squabble. They were looking at a direct, urgent mirror of the race riots happening on the streets of American cities. When Captain Picard debated the ethics of terrorism in The High Ground, or when Captain Kirk confronted the horrors of fascism in Patterns of Force, the sci-fi trapping acted as an intellectual buffer. It lowered people's immediate ideological defenses, allowing them to engage with complex, uncomfortable moral questions without instantly retreating into their real-world political camps. This is precisely why the international bans and network panics failed to derail the franchise. To the public, an episode being edited or pulled by a broadcaster wasn't a sign of the show's failure. It was proof of its relevance. The controversy validated the audience's belief that Star Trek wasn't just disposable, brainless entertainment. It was a vital, provocative, and living philosophy that was actively poking at the raw nerves of history. Ultimately, the lines drawn by censors only proved that Star Trek wasn't just disposable entertainment. It was holding up a mirror to a fractured world. The legacy of sci-fi provocation. When we look back at the locked vaults of television history, the censorship of Star Trek reveals a fascinating paradox. The episodes that networks and international governments fought the hardest to hide are the very ones that cemented the franchise's legacy as a cultural pillar. Censors often operate under the assumption that if you bury a controversial piece of art, you neutralize its power. But with Star Trek, the opposite happened. Every blacklisted tape, every sliced frame of body horror, and every banned broadcast served as an accidental endorsement. It proved that the writers weren't just spinning meaningless fantasies about plastic starship. They were holding up a razor-sharp scalpel to the real-world status quo. This friction is exactly what gives science fiction its enduring power. When Melinda Snodgrass penned Data's line about the Irish unification of 2024, she wasn't attempting to spark an international incident or advocate for violence. She was engaging in the fundamental work of a science fiction writer, looking at the cold, cyclical patterns of human history and projecting them forward without the filters of polite compromise. The panic that line caused in 1990 and the bizarre fascination it generated when the real-world calendar actually turned to 2024 shows how thin the line truly is between fictional speculation and political reality. Science fiction, at its best, doesn't predict the future to be right. It predicts the future to provoke us into thinking about the present. That provocation required an immense amount of creative courage. It meant pushing back against the safety of network mandates, just as William Shatner and Nichelle Nichols did when they forced television's first interracial kiss onto the airwaves, or as the writers of Conspiracy did when they used visceral body horror to warn us about institutional decay. Gene Roddenberry's utopia was never supposed to be an easy, comfortable paradise. It was meant to be a hard-won future, built on the premise that humanity can only evolve if it is willing to confront its own ugliest impulses, its darkest histories, and its deepest ideological divides. Ultimately, the forbidden archive of Star Trek reminds us why we need storytelling that is willing to risk being banned. In a media landscape that so often prioritizes safe, sanitized, and easily digestible entertainment, a show that actively courts controversy by tackling raw human truths is a rare and vital thing. The bans from the BBC, the panic from German broadcasters, and the corporate anxiety of American networks didn't break Star Trek. They defined it. Those moments of cultural collision proved that science fiction is at its absolute peak when it refuses to stay comfortably in the stars and instead dares to look us dead in the eye and challenge who we are right here on Earth. When we look back at the locked vaults of television history, the censorship of Star Trek reveals a fascinating truth. The episodes that networks and international governments fought the hardest to hide are the very ones that cemented the franchise's legacy as a cultural pillar. By daring to poke at real-world political nerves, confront historical traumas, and challenge its own utopian myth, the show proved it was never just disposable entertainment. It was a vital, living philosophy that forced us to look into a razor-sharp mirror and confront our deepest societal anxieties. Star Trek's willingness to cross the line of controversy is exactly why it remains an unshakable foundation of modern storytelling. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden history of science fiction, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video upload.